Today, on the Orange Table, we're not holding back at all.
I do have a lot of disagreements.
With all due respect, I think it's difficult to make the case that there isn't a problem of systemic racism within policing.
I'm not gonna vote for somebody like Trump or like the Republican Party because I kind of view it as like the party of the KKK.
Because all three of us actually have a commonality in that experience. I mean, my dad is
Oh.
from Aishah's family's from Nigeria, your family from Guyana.
No, that's really cool. I didn't really know that. That's amazing.
Take 40 minutes away from your Dane State assignment and join us for the most compelling episode of the Orange Table to date.
I'm Rebekah Adams, and I'm a senior in the Chemical and Biological Engineering department. And I'm also part of the Princeton writer for the Princeton Tory, and I'm president of the Princeton Open Campus Coalition. Disclosure, anything that I say is not their official opinion, so I want to make that clear.
Yeah, no, that's good to get on the record because we are going to be talking a lot about free speech. Actually, we're going to start there. I was wondering if you could respond. Have you had a chance to read the Daily Princetonian's editorial board? They just recently published a piece on free speech, urging Eyes Grouper to classify racist speech and hate speech as counter to the university's free speech policies, as a violation of those policies. And I was wondering if you did read it, what some of your main takeaways were and kind of what your rebuttal would be.
Yeah, I did read it in full, and I do have a lot of disagreements, as you could tell. So I think the one thing that they were proposing was to have hate speech as harassment, like included in the harassment policy. And I was like, okay, but like, how do we define it, first of all? Because the definition as like at present is very fluid. So the one thing that we could agree on right now is like, okay, hate speech can include any racial slur. I think we agree on that, but others may perceive it as like opinions that one may disagree with, or like a seemingly innocent statement, like, I don't know, like the most qualified person should get the job, or America's a melting pot, things like that, that, you know, has no intent of like harming someone. And once you have that very vague definition and you're trying to implement it in a very objective policy, while the university does have an obligation to protect its students, it's going to be very broad, and you're going to like fall into this like very slippery slope, and it's only going to get worse and worse from there if we're not very careful. And like, I think another thing they were proposing was like having anti-racist training as part of like their as part of the first year orientation program, I believe. And you know, I understand like much of the things they're proposing are like in goodwill, so I'm not like, you know, bashing on them for like doing anything wrong. It's just the approach seems very authoritarian, and it I actually like read a bit about like the premise of anti-racism, and like I think what I read is like based on like this critical theory you know, knowledge or something that like came up around the 60s or 70s, but I may check the history on that. But it's based on several inaccuracies, and it's also based on the premise that white people are implicitly racist. And it's not an idea I want to have encouraged in a place where we're supposed to be like, you know, respect each other as a community, not on the premise of race. And it can even go as extreme as saying like the concept of punctuality is like considered white. And I also disagree with the premise of white privilege based on like the statistics.
Okay.
And I could like explain more on that, but yeah, like
no, absolutely. But I'm just saying you've just thrown out so much there that we're going to have to. I first want to take us back a little bit, because at the beginning you were saying that there was a point of agreement between the POCC, a lot of other right-wing thinkers on campus, and a lot of left-wing thinkers in criticizing or seeing the use of racial slurs as harassment. And I think that's a point of agreement that I wasn't sure about, in all honesty. I think there are a lot of people on campus who are saying that racial slurs are protected under speech. That's the current policy of the administration as well. So I just wanted to kind of dive into that and make sure that there is agreement on that point, because I'm not sure it's as unanimous as we were discussing.
Yeah, I think the confusion really comes in with like whether or not should those words be sanctioned. So we could both agree that those words are wrong, and they shouldn't be said, right? But a person like me who's like more conservative leaning would think, well, even controversial, bigoted speech is still protected by, like, if you're to look at the free speech, absolutely, it is still protected under that. And a way to combat that is simply by communicating against those ideas and by, this like, because we have the ability to exercise our right to free speech. So why shouldn't we exercise that to change other people's opinions, right? Instead of depriving ourselves from like doing so. Yeah.
And me and Aishah as well, you'll definitely find an audience for more open conversation between conservatives, between liberals, between opposing views. But I'm wondering if you think there's any point that speech approaches a situation of harassment, if there's any point in which a student weaponizing racial slurs against another could needs to be sanctioned in order to protect the well-being of students. Is there a point that it can get to?
It's really hard to say now because there's so many vague lines. Because I know, let me just like deviate a little bit, because I know libel is something that can be prosecuted, like a character attack that is very serious. Slander is something that's wrong. It's just it's very interesting because the line is still vague, because I still believe there isn't like a societal consensus about what qualifies as harassment in the context of hate speech. Like, we could all agree here that racial slurs is wrong, but someone else may not agree. So that's why we can't just say, okay, let's sanction that. And it also depends on context as well, because someone can just say it, but it could be part of I don't know, like a lot of examples like that is used that could be part of like a rap lyric or something, or that they just say it within their own like social groups. Apparently, like people of a certain race could say like the N-word among their social groups. I've heard it before in my high school. So I think it also depends on context, and that's why I can't really give a definite answer as to when it would be considered as harassment at this point. I had to really think about that.
I just want to ask so I think you said something about some people might not think of it as if someone said a racial slur, some people might not think of it as harassment or hate speech or something like that. And I guess I'm wondering does that really mean that we as a society need to I guess kind of fall to the whims of those people who aren't necessarily good people? The KKK could say, I really don't care about the N-word, but that doesn't mean that we should agree with them, if you get what I'm saying. And then I guess I think context is also applied to a situation when you're looking at, I think, rules and regulations of the university. I think when they are considering a situation or an instance of, I don't know, hate speech or maybe a harassment or anything like that, they're going to look at context before they just kind of make a decision on what to do with said student or said situation. So I think context is implied before, so you can create a rule and people are going to look at it through the eyes of the context of the situation before they even make a decision. And so I think context is implied. And so I think maybe context doesn't necessarily need to be something that we consider when we create these rules and regulations about hate speech versus free speech.
So to address your first point, I'm not saying that we should agree obviously, with a KKK member saying, like, I hate Black people. Like, I'm not saying that. Like, I'm trying to, like, I don't know how familiar you are with Daryl Davis and, like, how he managed to, like, somehow convert KKK members to not, to, like, denounce the Klan and things like that. Like, I'm talking about the ability to do that. Like, you have these people who have these opinions, and they do have the right to say these opinions, even though we disagree with them. But we also have a right to ensure that they don't, like, say those things by, like, a more civil manner, by, like, actually, like, well, first by listening to what they say, but then explaining your position as to why that's wrong, and then somehow planting the seed so that they could change. Like, that's what I mean. And to your second point, I think context is still quite important, because I think you can just, like, you know, ban the N-word, but you can also ban Black people from calling white people cracker, for instance. I think both are wrong, and you know that's fine, but I don't think I think context still matters, if depending on how you say it or when you say it, whether you're parroting someone in the context of, like, a sarcastic argument, or whether you're just saying it not out of hate, because I've heard, like, things like that happen, even though I don't like the word, I don't like using the word, but I've heard things like that happen in that context. So I think it's really difficult to say, because someone says the word, they're saying it because they're hateful, they're saying it because it's racist. I think it also depends who you're talking to. Yeah, that's all I could really give on that. But
okay, I want to move on because I know we've been stuck on this point for a while, but I just want to say one more thing. I think we're going to have to agree to disagree, because I am the kind of person who doesn't really believe in, like, teaching people, like kind of like being the person to educate someone on how to be non-racist or that sort of thing, because I think it's sort of taxing as a Black person to have to, like, constantly put yourself sort of, I don't like, in harm's way, possibly, you know, like you said with Daryl, I think Davis, I think I've heard of his story, like him, like, I think the first time he, like, converted a KKK member, he was, like, in the car with him or something like that, and I was like, I wouldn't want to be in the same car as someone in the KKK. But I understand your point, but I'm not the kind of person who really supports that idea, but I get where you're coming from.
Can I just interject quickly? Because as much as we are disagreeing in this, I think that this is something beautiful is happening here, because I think this conversation around free speech has been massive on campus for a really long time. But this is one of the first times that we're actually getting people who disagree together, not in the same room, right? Because we're on the same Zoom call, but still actually addressing the concerns and arguments of each other. And I think that frankly a lot more of that needs to happen, because we have been stuck on the free speech point for a while. I did want to get us moving along. I think there was something that you said, two things that you said earlier that I found really interesting. One was your critique of critical race theory and saying that it was founded on some fundamental flaws. I want to hear more about that for sure, and then maybe give us a chance to respond.
so with critical race theory, it's like, I think it's a very when I read it, it seemed like a very Marxist premise. Well, it's based on the notion that every system in the U.S. or in Western culture or civilization is based on these very systematically racist institutions and white supremacy, and that America is, like, based on systemic racism, and it's not redeemable. And I think,
Wait, just to push back for a second, I'm not sure if I agree with that second point there, because I think that there are a lot of people who acknowledge that the United States was built on the system of slavery and was built during a time of systemic racism and massive oppression of specifically Black people. But I'm not sure that the critical race theory, in the way that it's taught, teaches that white people or the US as a country is irredeemable. I think that there are a lot of people who espouse those ideas that still think that the whole point of that theory is that we're trying to move people forward in education.
No, yeah, but I think there are several. I think there are just, like, specific players who happen to prescribe to this idea that
Right.
happens to like propel the notion that America's irredeemably racist. Actually, let me like ask a question. So what do you mean America's like founded on slavery? Do you mean like that's the only thing that it's founded on?
But I think that's the thing that a lot of Black people and a lot of critical race theorists find interesting, is that the United States is founded on so many things. It's founded on those inalienable rights. It's founded on freedom and justice for all. But there was a massive contradiction during the time that it was founded. So I think what they're saying is that a massive portion of the populace was left behind in that vision. I think that they're not criticizing or reducing all of the foundation of the country on racism, but they're pointing out the fact that the White House, the buildings of our government, were literally built by slave labor. I think they're pointing out that the US economy, as it thrived early on, was built on Black bodies. They're pointing out the fact that early war efforts that gave the United States stature in the international community, those were fought and won using Black soldiers that didn't even have rights in their own nation. I think those are the things they're pointing to.
At least from my perception, the way it's being portrayed is that it's all negative and like there's nothing we could do about it, and like you must repent for your sins or something
right.
like that.
And I think that plays well. I mean, that perception of critical race theory and almost just the entire approach of racial education from the left is what leads people to believe that Black people are almost being taught to victimize themselves. That's something you brought up and something that I hear often from Black conservative thinkers. And I'm wondering to what extent you think that is true.
I think the idea of like Black people can be individuals, and they don't have to be viewed in this very collectivist like type of mindset. We are individuals in spite of being the same race, and there is a reason why you see certain successful Black people, and there's a reason why you happen to see like these individuals just pop out of nowhere, and they just happen to like go past the system that works against them.
Right. And to pick up on your point about the Black community being talked about in the collective terms and not the individual terms, I think that, at least I can speak for myself, there are a lot of Black liberals who are critical of the way that the Democratic Party at some points takes for granted the Black vote. I mean, you can point to Joe Biden saying, "You ain't Black if you're not voting for me," and so forth. There are definitely moments where the Democratic Party has not fought hard enough to actually put forward policies that help the Black community. I think there are a lot of Black liberals who are even willing to point that out. But then the question I pose to you, and I think kind of where the confusion comes for a lot of Black liberals, is how the logical conclusion to that is to then join the Republican Party, given the fact that I think a lot of people think that they've given space to xenophobic and racist thinkers. So I wonder if that's a lot there in that question, but do your best.
Well, I'm not going to encourage, I'm not encouraging like Black people to join any party, period. I think that the premise comes with like, you should only trust yourself and your willpower instead of politicians that may or may not have the best interest in you. And that's like a very like, I guess that's a very cynical way of looking at it, but I think that's a very practical way of looking at it as well. But I think the reason why, like, if I were to like go with the argument that why you should be like, or be more like Republican or conservative or whatever, is because I think first of all it acknowledges individualism, which is important, which is something I mentioned. Second of all, it pushes for school choice, which I think is important, which I can explain on later if you want. Also, the idea that, you know, like hard work and self-reliance is important, and that you shouldn't depend on a welfare system that is broken and that people aren't willing to fix in the first place.
I think to your point of like being a monolith, I think a lot of Black people on the left also agree with that. But I think in they agree with it more in terms of like being reduced to stereotypes and being reduced to just like preconceived notions of what a Black person is. And I think um I think I think a lot of people do just kind of like vote Democrat, like because that's always kind of like what Black people have done. But I think a lot of people also vote Democrat because the Republican Party is not something that they want to align themselves with. Like for me, for example, I think yeah, there are a lot of problems with the Democratic Party, and I think definitely like they have taken advantage of the Black vote, and they haven't done much to help Black people recently. But I'm not gonna vote for somebody like Trump or like the Republican Party because I kind of view it as like the party of the KKK. That's just my opinion, though. I just think
Wait, actually, historically, the Democratic Party was the party of the KKK. They actually endorsed it, but
yes,
It
but
was definitely, but I think that point is often brought up by people, but I do think there was obviously the switch in '68, as you know, in which a lot of Southern conservatives switched to the Republican Party from the Democratic Party.
okay, so we're gonna kind of shift the conversation a little bit to how you kind of navigate being a conservative Black woman at Princeton. So I guess how do you kind of feel as like do you feel like a part of the Black community is a question I want to ask you. Do you feel like maybe you kind of have been not included because of your political views? How do you kind of navigate that situation, that community?
um, I've always been hesitant to join um, Black student groups, and when I did, I always felt that anything I say or would say that is like remotely conservative would probably be looked bad upon. Um, I don't know, especially when it comes to discussing like certain topics like I don't know systemic racism and how to tackle it better or how to approach it. Um, so I don't know for quite a long time until now. Obviously, I've been uh, very afraid to like speak out on these opinions and to provide different perspectives on how to look at these issues. Um, and it was mainly because in high school when I did that, um, I was called many names, uh, you know, from an Uncle Tom, uh, worse as a coon, and it's not fun. And you risk losing friends, and you know it happens. So so I just decided to keep my mouth shut about it for like 3 years, and just be a normal engineering student, just doing my thing without getting involved. Um, so it's been like a exercise of trying to just go with the flow pretty much. I attended a couple of meetings from different like Black student groups as well as like other like affinity groups as well because I do like interacting with people like me. I think it's like a good support system nonetheless. It's just when it comes to politics, it gets quite dangerous to express some of your opinions. So.
And then I had another question, kind of about you said your dad is an immigrant, and like, how did you kind of come to realize you were conservative? Does your family also have the same views as you? Like, do you guys agree on a lot of things or disagree on a lot of things? Like, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, so I guess, yeah, it's like it comes from the very West Indian premise that if you have like a immigrant father who's from like Guyana, well, my father's from Guyana, and he always emphasizes like, hard work. You gotta work hard. You gotta rely on yourself. Don't trust anyone but yourself. Only trusting God, but but like do these things, and you'll be like me. You'll succeed, and you'll be able to one day provide for your family. Things
It's
like
interesting
that.
because all three of us actually have a commonality in that experience. I mean, my dad is from
Oh,
Aishah's family's from Nigeria, your family from Guyana, and I think that definitely the values you're talking about of hard work and individuality, they definitely hit home. I'm sure that we all have stories we can tell about how our parents hammered home education and self-reliance. I also think it frames this conversation in even a more interesting fashion. It's like how that common experience leads to different ideological uptakes. Yeah, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt, but I just thought it was a cool thing to point out.
No, that's really cool. I didn't really know that. That's amazing then. But okay, so but I think what my dad like taught me was how to look at different cultures and different religions in spite of my upbringing, and learned how to think for myself. So it's not like he didn't care. He didn't care like what I believe. Like he only cared that I followed his foundational principles, obviously, but like I learned how to really think based on that foundation. So in spite of like my more conservative upbringing, there are times where I've definitely shifted more like liberal, and I think I've been more to the left in middle school, came a little back in high school, and then like that shifted again in college because I was just trying to discover like how this like worked. I didn't really have like a set position in anything yet. I was still learning.
Mm-hmm. That's a really interesting story of kind of ebbing back and forth. Something I really appreciate about you and kind of the way you've conducted yourself in this conversation is your adherence to stats. And there's like the one other conversation we wanted to have, I think, has a lot of statistics behind it, and that's the issue of police brutality specifically affecting Black Americans. I was looking before from data from the FBI, and of course, Black people make up 13% of the US population, but they made up 31% of all people killed by police and 39% of people killed by police while not attacking. I was wondering if you could kind of respond to the reckoning over the summer with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many other cases, and how, first of all, how that impacted you on a personal level. But actually, let's start there.
I could start with the more personal level before I analyze the objective like statistics. So yeah, when I first heard of it, obviously it's a tragedy, and I think something like that should have never happened. And I think the way that like after reading the reports and the autopsy reports and things like that, the way that the policemen should have handled it was not appropriate at all. Like I think we agree with that. And I think to me it's an indicator. It's not so much an indicator, however, that all policemen are bad. It's just that there's something wrong with either how they're like, or how they're trained, or how they, I don't know, like how they perceive. It could just be how some people perceive Black people. I don't know. I just see this as a training error, but that's my perception, and you could disagree with that. I know there's some nuances to the case based on some anecdotes that I've heard. So in terms of like,
but would you say, like, given the statistics and the obvious disproportionality of them, do you think that police brutality is a massive problem? Like, I think a lot of conservatives have not been willing to give it the time and attention and point it out as a disproportionate example of racism. I guess going back to our conversation before about white privilege, I guess the thing is you can point all those stats about how Asian people, Black people, and so forth can outperform white groups in certain metrics, but then at the end of the day, we get to the issue of a white person getting pulled over for, I don't know, in Sandra Bland's case, I think it was a taillight being out. There's a different possibility. If you're a Black person, if you're a Latino person, you have the possibility to end up dead as a result, a statistical probability to end up dead as a result of an interaction like that a white person doesn't have to live in fear of. And that's kind of that's where I come from, the white privilege debate. I'm saying that I live an experience where I can be subjected to violence at a rate higher than you. I can face injustice at a level that is statistically unlikely for you. I guess that's just my perspective on it.
I think that's a very fair perspective. I'm not disagreeing with you that police brutality is an issue. I think it's an issue, period, regardless of race. I think there's a bigger nuanced issue still, and it's hard to say there is systemic police racism when there could be. I think I remember reading there's issues with like training, mental health. There's like a statistic that had like a high percentage of how many policemen are killed. I don't think it also includes whether Black policemen happen to shoot a Black unarmed man. I think the context still matters here. So that's really something I could explain here.
I mean, with all due respect, I think it's difficult to make the case that there isn't a problem of systemic racism within policing in the United States. I mean, if you look at just the cases in our lifetime, I mean, our generation is the one that grew up, what were we, 14, 13, around the time of Michael Brown and Ferguson, and we've seen case after case after case in which we have it on video, Rebekah. We have complete evidence that it was an unjustified murder and no sort of justice in almost all cases. I mean, George Floyd's one of the few examples where we at least got some sort of outcome in terms of punishment for the officer, but I think it's hard to make the claim that there's not systemic racism within the institution. And I think it's important to know that that's not saying then, I think it's a somewhat of a straw man to then say that liberals are claiming that the police force is filled with racists in a majority. I don't think there are many people making that argument. I think that they're simply pointing out that there's a massive issue here that has to be dealt with.
Because I guess I'll push back a little bit here with all the cases, because I took some time to look, for example, at Jacob Blake case. I think that is a little bit complicated because I don't know if you recall, but they found a knife under the floorboard of his car. He resisted arrest, things like that. He already had a warrant out for his arrest. I really wish it didn't happen, but things like that. Like, I don't know how to really. Sorry, what were you gonna say?
No, I think the big thing to point out here, though, is that we're not saying the argument on behalf of people who are viewing this as a massive problem is not necessarily that every single person who's shot by police does not have any difficulties in their past. But the important thing is that we have a videotape in the case of Jacob Blake in which, I mean, when he's approaching the car and the officer shoots him, I think, how many times was it? It was at least, I think it was 7 times in the back. At that moment in time, he is of no threat to the officer. I mean, I think that you can make all these arguments about criminal history. You can make all these arguments about weapons that were found on the scene. But at the end of the day, that situation could have been de-escalated and not ended in a man's life being ended in front of his children. I think 3 of his sons were in the back seat at the time. So I would push back on that, saying that I don't know whether it's fair to malign the people who this happens to and then use that as a way to potentially explain the officer's actions.
Oh no, I'm not justifying like the officer's actions.
Okay.
But I do want to like add a little more to that because now we're because I remember I saw another videotape that he did punch another officer who initially tried to tase him, and that didn't work, and then there was like some scuffle behind the car until he walked around the other side, and that's when he got shot 7 times in the back.
Just to be clear for
Obviously,
audience, there was a second video that came out, I think, a couple of days after that did show what you're describing, Rebekah. But I think, again, there's still the point of, I mean, the police, it's their job to de-escalate. It's their job to find a way to allow everyone to live through all of these encounters.
I agree with that. I definitely agree with that. I'm not saying that police brutality isn't an issue. I'm just saying that there are certain cases, but I'm not saying like, you know, there isn't an issue, there isn't like a potential even systemic racist issue. That's always something I'm still trying to like, you know, understand and confirm, because a part of like every time I look at these like cases and then statistics, I'm like, okay, there is like systemic like police racism, and then I find like something in contradiction. I'm like, okay, there's something nuanced here that we're missing. I don't know, there's something that we're missing here, and it's not this blanketed statement.
I think that something that I was just interested in talking to you about, we discussed kind of the movement of Black people from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. And I can't let this interview go by without asking you your opinion on Candace Owens, and kind of the ownership she's taken over that whole movement. Because I mean, I think that your style in terms of advocating for conservatism is very different from hers. And I wonder what your impressions are of her, and whether is she someone you look up to? Is she someone that you maybe are frustrated by at certain points?
I do respect her. I think like she
the girl's definitely bold.
Yeah. Yeah. But I do respect her. Like I look up to her in a sense that, okay, there's someone like me who, you know, at least speaks boldly about her position, even though I may not agree with some of the things she says. I know she doesn't believe in climate change, and I do. So, surprise, surprise. But I think having a very bold mindset is good, and I think having a formalized you know, Blexit movement is like, I think it's a good force. Although like some of her views I do disagree with, obviously. I do think it's important, however, to at least have some force to like encourage minorities to just think for themselves.
But I think Candace Owens is someone who is more interested in the controversy of it all, and more interested in the headlines. And I think that she's gotten to the point where, I mean, it's outrageous. The things that she said in the wake of George Floyd's murder, spending most of her time on Twitter maligning the man. I just think because this is a show about opinions, I'm not a fan of Candace Owens. I think that she largely operates as a way for conservatives and in particular racists in our country to justify their opinion by saying that it comes out of the mouth of a Black woman. But I think that's not to say then that the entire movement of Black conservatism should then be maligned or taken to only be Candace Owens.
Yeah, I mean, I like I'm more inclined to figures like Klacik. You know, I think she's like, when I saw that video, I was like, yeah, that's someone I want to be like.
Yeah,
and also I heard her. Yeah, and I saw her interview I watched Tim Pool. You know, because I think he's a pretty interesting journalist, and I think she did an interview with him, and she seemed like a pretty down, very rational woman, like you said. So, you know, that's someone I also respect. You know, like I don't agree with Candace Owens. I'm not saying like she's obviously be censored. I guess my advice to her is just to be a little more, you know, like open to the conversation and open to the premise that you would hope to achieve a compromise. Because when I'm speaking to you guys, like I don't want to like I don't really want to change your mind. I want to like hopefully reach some sort of agreement. And the good thing is that we did reach certain agreement on certain points, and we disagreed on other points.
We did. We reached more agreement than I thought we would. I'll be honest.
Yeah.
I think a good place to end it is just with a conversation around kind of acknowledging what happened today in terms of an open conversation between disagreeing parties, and I guess maybe a few comments from all of us on how important this type of exchange is, because we are in a moment, in my opinion, because I cover a lot of racial issues on campus for the Prince. We're in a moment where there needs to be a vibrant discussion about what the university is going to do in order to address race on campus. There, Eis Gruber and a number of committees are right now deliberating on what policies they're going to put forward in terms of faculty diversification, racial justice education, affinity spaces, and so forth. And these are incredibly interesting and important issues. And I'd like to see more of a vibrant conversation on campus around how we go about implementing those things. And I want to hear from conservatives who, like yourself, might be critical of critical race theory and critical of some of these other ideas of implicit bias and so forth. I want to hear those perspectives, and I want also others to have the opportunity to respond so that we can actually get somewhere. Anyone have any last thoughts on anything I just said or anything we talked about?
I think, yeah, I think I just really agree. I think it's definitely important for us to be having these conversations, and I think for people to kind of come with an open mind and not necessarily to change someone's mind or change their opinion, because it's likely that's not going to happen in one conversation, but just to come to maybe some sort of agreement, like Rebekah said, because I think that's kind of the best way to go about it when you have like really differing opinions.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the one thing that Princeton students should practice is the ability to learn how to open a conversation. Like whenever someone expresses a like, completely non-mainstream opinion, they should always ask, why do you have that opinion? Try to challenge it. And they may learn something. They may, reach an agreement with that other person. I think it's not only a good skill to communicate, but I think it's important if we're trying to make a very important change within the issue of like racial justice and equality that requires, like in this case, like a policy change and addressing that. So like I think a compromise between like two different sides is very much in order for that to happen. And I think that this comes with learning how to listen and just having an open mind.
Yes, hopefully there'll be many more conversations like this. We want to thank Rebekah for being here for our third episode of the Orange Table. That is a wrap.